My story begins a little over a month ago, when my father received a phone call from his brother Michael, who lived in the United States. My family is, in fact, American. Both my brother James and I were born there, but moved to London when we were very young. My father is a history professor and was offered a job at King's College when both James and I were mere toddlers, so our whole family moved, and we have lived there ever since. Despite the distance, though, we stayed close to our relatives in America. We would go back at least once a year, either for Thanksgiving or Christmas. Before Grandma passed, we'd gather at the house my father and his siblings grew up in. Uncle Mike, Aunt Lily, and her husband, along with my twin cousins, Samantha and Angelina, would all try to make sure we spent at least a week together. My father's family was very close-knit, and he felt it was important that my brother and I knew our family, despite the distance. I loved those days. I always looked forward to visiting Grandma and Grandpa and seeing my cousins. They would always make fun of my growing English accent, but I knew it was in jest. As we grew older and technology made it easier to keep in touch, we became best friends, Skyping, Facebooking, and Snapchatting each other almost every day. As much flack as social media gets, I can tell you that it is truly the reason my cousins and I were so close. For all of us, the highlight of the year was gathering at our grandparents' house. But all that changed after Grandma passed. Grandpa became withdrawn. Our weekly calls to him became shorter and shorter. He would end them abruptly, saying he was either not feeling well or that he had things to take care of. Soon, the weekly calls became fortnight calls. Then those became monthly calls, and soon Grandpa just stopped picking up our calls altogether. Aunt Lily and Uncle Mike would drive over to make sure he was okay. According to them, he had become so angry after Grandma's death. They tried to get him to see someone, a professional, to help deal with her passing, but this just made him push them away even more. Soon, he cut off all communication with them and even moved out of his house. He didn't even tell us where he was going. It seemed like losing Grandma was too much for him, and that even the sight of his family reminded him too much of her. When Uncle Mike and Aunt Lily tried to get the police to find Grandpa after he moved, they said nothing could be done. That Grandpa was an adult, and that it wasn't against the law to just pack up and move and not tell your family. And that's how he lost Grandpa. Needless to say, that call from Uncle Mike took the wind out of all of us. It had been over 20 years since any of the family had seen or heard from Grandpa, so to get this news was crushing. According to Uncle Mike, Grandpa had been living in Seattle. A neighbor had found him. She hadn't seen him for days, and the mail and newspapers were piling up. She had been given a key in case of emergencies. Worried, she used it and found him at the bottom of his basement stairs. He had apparently tripped and fallen, breaking his neck. We were all on a plane to Seattle the next day. It was surreal. My head kept playing the last time we were all together and happy before Grandma died. It was Christmas. I was probably about 7. The whole family was together. I can remember the smell of the turkey wafting out from the kitchen. Samantha and Angelina were teasing young James. My parents and the rest of the adults were drinking sherry and wine while Grandpa sipped on his whiskey. We were all so happy. Grandma passed barely 2 weeks after that. We got the news the same way, a call from Uncle Mike. Eerily, she had died the exact same way. Grandpa found her at the bottom of the basement stairs, with her neck broken. This was going to give me a complex about basement stairs. I vowed right then and there that I would never live in a house with a basement. A day after arriving in Seattle, we met the rest of the family at Grandpa's new house. The sky was grey and it was pouring down with rain. Fitting, I thought. We waited on the porch for the rest of the family to arrive. The bank was going to put it up for sale. We were going to go through it and clean it out a little and see if there was anything we'd want to keep. There were hugs all round when everyone arrived. It was also a little bit awkward. I mean, yes, our grandfather and father had just died, but we also hadn't had contact with him for over 20 years. There was both a mix of emotions as well as a lack of it in the air. What do you say to each other in a situation like this? Uncle Mike opened the door and we all filed in. The first thing that hit me was the musky stench of the place. The air was heavy and it smelled like a window hadn't been opened in years. The curtains were drawn and everything was shrouded in darkness. Uncle Mike went over to one of the windows and drew back the curtains, letting in the light. What we saw astounded us. The entire living room was filled with stacks upon stacks of newspapers and magazines. They lined the walls, some yellowed with age. It looked like a house of a hoarder. My Aunt Lily started to tear up. She couldn't believe her father had lived like this. As we went through the house, things didn't improve. It wasn't that the house was dirty. It was just really cluttered. Mostly with books, magazines, and newspapers. Some of them were cut up. Some had articles and paragraphs underlined and highlighted. It really did seem like Grandpa had lost it in his last years. There weren't any personal items or memorabilia in the house. No photos of the family, no paintings, no trinkets or souvenirs. Nothing. The walls were bare, except for a simple clock that hung on the wall and the newspapers and books that lined them. No, actually, I lie. There was one photo. In the bedroom, on the nightstand, was a photo of Grandpa and Grandma on their wedding day. It was faded and yellow, but you could see the joy and excitement in their faces. Grandma was looking at the camera while Grandpa was looking at her adoringly. He loved her so much. I wonder what being in love like that must be like. Finally, it was time to check out the basement. We, as a family, had been slightly dreading this. After all, this is where Grandpa had died. Strangely, the door to the basement was thick and heavy, made of solid wood. There was a big padlock on it as well. Imagine an old castle door from the time of knights and kings. That was what this door looked like. Dark brown, thick metal strips running across it as if for reinforcement. It was already open. My brother James was the first to walk down the steps. I followed. What we discovered at the bottom astounded us even more than the rest of the house. Whereas the upstairs was cluttered, down here, everything was neatly organized. The whole basement was filled with standalone shelves. On each shelf were various items. Everything from dolls to music boxes to larger items like mirrors and even old paintings. Under each item was a date. I didn't know what to make of it. The whole family didn't know what to make of it. It was all so bizarre. Everything, from Grandpa's estrangement to this house. It really did seem like Grandpa had lost his mind in his old age and gotten progressively worse before his death. We went through the house, looking for things that we might want to keep to remember Grandpa by, but there really wasn't much in the house. No personal items, I mean. Aunt Lily decided she wanted to keep the wedding photo we found in the bedroom. Uncle Mike, Grandpa's cane. Other than those two items, there really wasn't anything we recognized as Grandpa's. We decided to also go through the basement. If anything in this house had any value, it seemed it would have been in the basement. Either way, there seemed to be a few interesting pieces at least, items that may be worth keeping. Samantha found a small silver music box she decided she would like to keep. It looked very old, and it was quite heavy too. Probably made of real silver. It was adorned with intricate carvings. The silver had been tarnished by time. The inside seemed to have been made by real red velvet, though that too was now faded. When opened, it played the most melancholy tune, which just tugged at the heartstrings, making you feel blue and sad. It really was a beautiful piece of art. Angelina decided she wanted to keep a strange painting she found on one of the shelves. She was starting graduate school soon and would be moving into a new studio and thought it would look great on the wall. It wasn't a very nice looking painting, to be honest. It was of a child standing with his hands covering his ears. Behind him was a woman lying on a bed, seemingly asleep. It gave me a bit of the EBGBs, but Angelina thought it was artistic and that it would make a great conversation piece. Uncle Mike probably bagged the biggest find, a diamond-encrusted watch. Well, it looked like it was diamond-encrusted at least. We didn't really think it was, but it was sure blinged out. My parents found a set of silver candlestick holders and a gilded mirror they thought would look good in the home. I myself found a few pieces of jewelry. I have always been attracted to gemstones, and I found a whole collection on one of the shelves. A ring, a necklace and earring set, along with another locket that had a beautiful deep blue gem in it. Grandpa's funeral was a couple of days later. It was small, just the family and a couple of neighbors, including the lady next door who had found him. A few days after that, we held an estate sale, mainly for the things in the basement. Things that didn't sell there, we either sold to a consignment store or donated to Goodwill. And that was that. The bank then took possession of the house and we went our separate ways again for now. We didn't think anything would change really. After all, Grandpa hadn't been in our lives for so long now. But of course, I wouldn't be writing this if that was all there was to this story. Within a month of Grandpa's funeral, my entire family was either dead or committed. Within a month of Grandpa's funeral, I was a fugitive. It started with Samantha. 2 days after Grandpa's funeral, my Aunt Lily and her husband found her hanging from the rafters of her bedroom ceiling. She had hanged herself. There was no note. Nobody could explain it. It sounds cliché, but she had had everything going for her. She had graduated university and had just started her dream job. She had the perfect boyfriend and friends who loved her. It just made no sense. When my parents told me the news, I just went numb. We had just come back from one family funeral and we were now getting ready to fly back to the States for another. But that was just the beginning. The whole family was understandably besides themselves, but Angelina was just stoic. Her eyes glassy and glazed over, like she wasn't even in her body. She moved around like a ghost. I overheard my Aunt Lily saying to my Uncle Mike that Angelina wasn't going to recover from this. Samantha was her twin after all. The two of them were as close as any two individuals could be. She was afraid that Samantha's death had broken her. And it would seem she was right. 4 days after Angelina's funeral, the police were called to my aunt and uncle's home. A neighbor, out for an early morning jog, had seen the front door open and what looked like blood and drag marks on the driveway. They found my aunt and uncle's home trashed. Furniture had been broken, the walls had been graffitied, and my aunt and uncle were found with their throats slashed and their bodies cut open. Upstairs in our old bedroom, they found Angelina covered in blood, talking to herself and cutting herself with what seemed to be the blade that had killed her parents. She had their bloody hearts laid out on her bed. Authorities concluded that the death of her twin made her snap. She was committed to a psychiatric hospital. When they looked in her studio, they found it in the same condition as her parents' place, trashed and graffitied. Illegible writing, seemingly in Latin or gibberish, was strewn all over the walls. Everything was destroyed, except the painting that she had brought back from Grandpa's. Soon after that, we were back in the States yet again. This time for Uncle Mike's funeral. It was getting ridiculous now. It felt like we were cursed. Uncle Mike had been found in his apartment, burnt to a crisp. They had to identify him by his dental records. But here is the strange part. Nothing else in his apartment was burnt. There was no fire. Everything was intact, except him. Everything, including the diamond-encrusted watch that he had found in Grandpa's house, that was still on his wrist, unscathed. That was when I knew something wasn't right. These can't be coincidences. Something was happening here, something supernatural. I brought this up over Sunday dinner to my parents and my brother James, and they all shut me down. They said I was being disrespectful, that this wasn't the time for my imagination to run. That's when I started to notice odd things happening in my parents' home. My brother James was in college, but still living at home. They all just began acting differently, distant, like something was always on their mind. Initially, I shrugged it off. After all, our family had gone through more than most in the span of just a month. Finding our long-lost grandfather, burying him, then losing everyone else, it was bound to take a toll on them. But then 2 weeks ago, I went over for our usual Sunday family dinner, and I knew it was more than that. I walked in to find a bloodbath. My parents were bludgeoned by what looked like the candlestick holders Mom had brought back from Grandpa's. I screamed and ran around the house looking for my brother, but I couldn't find him. I held my parents, trying to will them back to life, but they were gone. Frozen on their faces was a look of pure terror. A horrible thought occurred. Had my brother done this? Had my brother done this? I was about to call the police when I heard a tapping from the foyer. I froze. Was it an intruder? Was the murderer still in the house? Was he going to finish me off too? The tapping continued, like fingernails on a window. I went into the kitchen and grabbed a knife before slowly creeping towards the sound. I reached the foyer, but there was no one there. Nothing that looked like it could have made that sound. I noticed my mom had hung the mirror she found at Grandpa's on the wall by the front door. I glanced at it briefly, catching my reflection, when I heard the tapping again. It was coming from inside the mirror. I moved closer towards it. Tap, tap, tap. I leaned in closer. What was tapping against the mirror? What was tapping against the mirror? Just as I did so, my brother's face suddenly appeared, twisted in an agonizing silent scream. He was in the mirror. But how? I cried and screamed, looking behind the mirror, but there was nothing behind it. James was in the mirror. As he tried to claw at the glass, it made that tapping sound. I screamed at James to hold on, that I would get him out, even though I had no clue how to. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. I stood there, staring at the mirror. What had happened? What was going on? I stumbled back and sat on the stairs, in shock. My parents were dead, and my brother was trapped in a mirror. How is this possible? That's when the pieces started to fall into place. Grandpa's basement, the heavy basement door, him distancing himself from us, the odd items, everything that had started happening after we brought the objects home. Grandpa was collecting cursed objects for some reason. Maybe to keep them safe. Maybe his death wasn't so accidental. Maybe Grandma's wasn't either. Maybe someone or something had killed them. The realization hit me. Oh my God, what had we done? We had released them all back into the world. Goodness knows where they have ended up by now, what sort of carnage they have caused. I knew then I couldn't call the police. My parents were dead, with my fingerprints all over them, and my brother was missing. I was covered in their blood. They'd locked me up for killing them. No, I had to get back to the States to try and get these objects back, to find out exactly what Grandpa was doing, to find out who exactly he was. And that leads me to where I am now, a fugitive. I know it's only a matter of time until my parents are found. It kills me to leave them like that, but I have no choice. Who would believe me? No. I have to get to the bottom of this, to find out who Grandpa was and what these objects are. I'm telling you my story in case you've come across one of Grandpa's objects. I can't remember what they all were, but if you've recently bought something from a consignment store or Goodwill, or someone has given you something and odd things have started occurring, please reach out to me. I'm not sure what I can do to stop it. I'm not sure what I can do at all. Right now, the best I can do is warn you that this is real. So please, be careful.